It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Antoine Hakim. He's a recipient of the 2017 Canada Gairdner Wightman Award. The Canada Gairdner Wightman Award recognizes exceptional leadership in the medical sciences, and I'd like to point out that the 2015 awardee was our current president of the Gairdner Foundation, Dr. Janet Rassant. Dr. Hakim is being recognized today for his outstanding research into strokes and their consequences in championing stroke prevention and treatment in Canada and beyond. He's an emeritus professor in the Department of Neurology at the University of Ottawa. A bit about his training: he completed his BSc at the Washington State University and his MSc at University of Calgary, both in chemical engineering. And then he completed a doctorate at the Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute with Gerald Moss on the quantification and contribution of pentose phosphate pathway in brain glucose metabolism. He then completed an MD at Albany College, Medical College, and his medical residency and postdoc training at the Montreal Heart Institute. He's received numerous recognitions for his work. I'll just mention a few: election to the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame, elected Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He's received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012 and was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2007. Now, for his research contributions, he characterized a penumbral region around the area of a stroke's ischemic core. This is a brain tissue that had enough energy to survive for a short period of time after blood loss, and had the potential, at least, to regain function after restoration of blood flow. So, not content with these discoveries, he then pushed to establish a Canadian Stroke Network and a Canadian Centre of Excellence, and developed a partnership with the Heart and Stroke Foundation and other organizations to develop a nationwide stroke strategy. This has been updated on a regular basis and promotes the rapid diagnosis and treatment after a stroke that has saved many lives and improved, obviously, the quality of life for many people and their families. Today, he'll speak to us about "It took a village, but stroke is now more treatable." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating and welcoming Dr. Tony Hakim to the podium.
Thank you so very much, and I'm really, really honored to be up here. The recognition by the Gairdner Foundation has really meant a tremendous amount to me and my environment. And after Dr. Raprioli's talk this morning, promising that we're all going to live to be 140 years old, I'm tempted to say that I'm delighted that the Gairdner Foundation has recognized me so early in my career. This is the CT scan of a patient in the year 2000. It wasn't that many years ago. In the year 2000, this patient probably felt suddenly that the right side of his body was weak, that his speech was impacted, and there was nothing he could do. So he went to bed, and the following morning, hoping the thing would go away, the following morning it was still bad, so he came to the emergency room. And over time, this is the CT scan that one sees with a major portion of this patient's brain that has been destroyed. So this patient is now handicapped for life. He cannot work anymore. He cannot pay taxes anymore. His wife has to take care of him. She has to quit her job and stay at home, so she's also not working and not paying taxes anymore. So what I'm really trying to make you appreciate is the incredible consequences that a stroke like this had created, both for the individual, the family, and society. It is my hope that through the work of the Canadian Stroke Network and other advances that we're going to see, that this is going to become a historical slide, a CT scan of something that simply doesn't happen anymore. Our appreciation for the changes that were occurring, I drew this graph, this curve myself, based on the information that patients who had come to the Montreal Neurological Institute and agreed to be studied in our PET scan and in our MRI scan and our CT scan, in fact, delivered this information that allowed me to draw this curve, which I will talk about. I'm not the one who invented the concept of penumbra. The concept of penumbra had been invented in animal studies, but what we have done is to show that the penumbra actually exists in the human brain as well when it is impacted by a stroke. You and I are sitting here in the audience, and every 100 grams of your brain every minute receives 50 milliliters of blood. It is a major fraction of what your heart is putting out, even though this is a relatively small organ. If over time we develop some hardening of the arteries and blood flow to our brain begins to decrease, the brain says, no problem. I'm going to simply increase the extraction of oxygen from the trickle of blood that's coming up and increase the extraction of glucose from the trickle of blood, and you will not know that anything is different as blood flow to your brain decreases. However, the CT scan that I showed you is probably the result of a blood clot that came from somewhere, the heart, the leg, somewhere, and it went up and packed itself against a major artery that feeds a portion of the brain. What we have learned is that hole that I showed you in the CT scan does not occur all at once. It does not occur in the first few minutes of the event. It takes hours for it to develop that maturity of the damage that you saw on that CT scan. And the reason for that is this. If blood flow anywhere in the brain is below 10 milliliters per 100 grams per minute, death of the cells is instantaneous. That leaves us with this portion between 12 and 20 milliliters per 100 grams per minute. What is going on there is those cells go quiet. They are alive, but they're not dead. They go quiet, resulting in symptoms. So there is deficit. The leg is dragging, the speech is gone. But if you would only increase the blood flow above 20, all of a sudden, the symptoms disappear. The deficits go away. The cells thank you for giving them back their breath. They had been holding their breath for a while, waiting for something good to happen. And this is the something good that would happen. Is therefore, suddenly, stroke became something that was potentially reversible from an event that otherwise had committed the individual to lifelong dependency. This then made people ask the question, do you mean that if I busted that clot, that I would reverse symptoms of a patient who had come in with a stroke? I would bust the clot, blood would go back to the brain, that region of the brain that had been holding its breath would get back its blood supply, and everything would be back to normal. And the answer was yes. And so there was a study done by NINDS, published in 1995, that showed, in fact, that if you bust a clot using a drug called TPA, that symptoms recover, having appeared in the stroke. The trick was that the part of the brain that was in the penumbra zone could not hold its breath for a long time. You had about 4 hours, 5 hours, during which this patient had to get to the drug, obtain the drug, and then everything would be fine. If it took longer than that, that part of the brain that was called penumbra at the beginning, in fact, became an infarct. The Canadian Stroke Network came into existence in the year 2000. That was 5 years after this TPA had been invented and approved. And in Canada, 1% of patients with a stroke were getting this drug. We had a hell of a lot of work to do, and we had to do it fairly rapidly. We knew that there were going to be toes that we were going to have to step on, but we had to do it because it was the right thing to do. So the Canadian Stroke Network was created. I must now say that I'm very grateful that in Canada we invented something called networks of centers of excellence. This is a strictly Canadian invention, and in fact more countries now are sort of copying this concept. And what the concept is that we give you money and we're asking you to make 1 + 1 = 3. And by that I mean that you get scientists and clinicians to work together, you work with healthcare providers, you work with governments, you work with whoever you have to work with to advance the science and also bring it into application. When we came into existence, the group that we knew we had to work with was the Heart and Stroke Foundation. We were not allowed, we didn't think we would be allowed in the Canadian Stroke Network to spend our money to buy TV ads to teach the public that when your arm drops, if 1 minute you are unable to do something that you were able to do just a minute ago, call 911 and get to the emergency room. We weren't allowed to buy TV ads, and so we developed a relationship with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and they were allowed to then educate the public about the symptoms of stroke and what to do about that in a very quick response. We categorized hospitals. If there was a time when I was worried that my body would be found floating on the Ottawa River, it was because we said to some hospitals, yes, we know you've been taking care of stroke for 100 years, but you don't have a CT scan and you don't have a neurologist on call. You're out of the business of stroke. And that was not well received, so there was resistance at a variety of levels. Heart and Stroke Foundation launched the TV campaign, multiple meetings with paramedics. The people who would come to take you to the emergency room said, I'm in no hurry, there is nothing to do. We had to design courses to sit with them and say, turn on your red lights and turn on your sirens when you get a call for a stroke patient. And then we had to organize rapid hospital response to stroke. When a neurologist got called at home in the year 2000 to be told that there was a stroke patient in the emergency room, I said, make him comfortable, I'll see him tomorrow morning. That was not acceptable anymore. I had to get out of my pajamas in the middle of the night and drive rapidly to the emergency room. And many of my colleagues had to move houses to live closer to the emergency room where they would be. And, you know, none of this was easy. And there were many times when I was taken aside and spoken to, but we had to just continue doing what we did. And let me give you one other example about the municipal leaders. Ambulances are owned by municipalities. I didn't know that. And if the right hospital for whom you need to take this patient that was totally prepared to take care of the patient was 2 miles across from your municipal line, the ambulance was not allowed to go that, but was forced to drive 30 kilometers to go down to a hospital within the municipality. We sat down with them and said that was unacceptable. And I must say, I want to pay credit to all of the give credit to all of the people who, in fact, committed themselves to work with us. That's why the title of my talk is, It Took a Village. This is not Tony Hakim. There are times when I feel, thank you for the enormous recognition, but you know what? I need 200 people behind me here who want to share this recognition with me. We re-identified hospitals depending on what facilities they had, and so these hospitals, if they didn't have a scanner, if they didn't have a neurologist, were out of the business, and we categorized them as district hospitals and regional stroke centers depending on what they were able to do. We worked very hard to develop best practice guidelines. Best practice guidelines told my colleagues, the neurologists, how quickly to respond, told my emergency room colleagues how quickly to respond, told the radiologists how quickly to turn on the CT scan to take a patient and put them in, and no, the stroke patient cannot wait after the twisted ankle and the broken hip. The stroke patient gets priority, and he or she gets sent in to get the kind of care that they needed. That was not simple. It really required that we review the literature very extensively, and that's how the best practice guidelines in Canada got developed. And we were tough. We were tough on ourselves. We were tough on people around us. These were the best practice guidelines. It said that if a patient with a stroke came to the emergency room, within 1 minute, they had to be identified as a stroke patient and sent on down the line. Door to doctor, 10 minutes. Door to stroke team notification. The hospital anytime is stroke code, and you have to get down to the emergency room regardless of what else you're doing. Door to CT scan, 30 minutes. Door to needle, 60 minutes. Admission to monitor bed within 3 hours. As a result, Canada became known around the world for doing things right in the field of stroke. And in the year 2000, now, you will see that 40% of stroke patients were getting TPA. The reason is that it's never going to be 100%. Some people get immediately better. They suffered a transient ischemic attack. They're not going to get a drug because it wasn't a blood clot that went and impacted against the blood vessel. It was a tiny blood clot that just was traveling through, and that requires a different kind of approach. And if the patient suffered deficit because of a hemorrhage, you wouldn't give them a drug that busts a clot. So we think that 40% to 50% is probably the maximum percentage of stroke patients who are going to get this drug. There were a number of additional benefits that came our way from the work that was done. Controlling stroke risk factors improved because people began to understand that there are vascular risk factors that lead to the kind of situation that I've described. The number of stroke patients admitted decreased, not because we cured the problem, but because we got better at preventing it. We developed something called stroke prevention clinics. These were never heard of, and now there was stroke prevention clinics, and visits to them increased by 34%. And the CSN helped structure and advance stroke recovery. Stroke Congress, and prior to the existence of the Canadian Stroke Network, if a Canadian wanted to show off their good work in the field of stroke, they had to go to the US. Now we have something called the Stroke Congress, where Canadians can gather basic scientists, clinicians, emergency room physicians, hospital administrators can come to the Stroke Congress. And the CSN now contributed to the formation of the next generation of neurologists because they had to learn that neurology wasn't the kind of specialty where you sat in bed at night and when your phone rang, you said, "I'll see you in the morning." You had to really move your butt and get out there. In addition, provinces that imposed stroke strategies had lower 30-day stroke mortality. And the reason I say provinces that imposed stroke strategies is if there is a note of embarrassment, it's because not every province has jumped on this bandwagon, and we still have work to do. The Canadian Best Practice Guidelines, in the process of doing all of this, and in the process of showing the application of the stroke strategy, was the only set endorsed by the World Stroke Organization, and we have to be very proud of that. Now let me take you somewhere that my stroke patients would come and educate me about their issues, and that's how I got into the field of dementia. As I said, this is an early recognition. My next career is going to be in dementia. It's a joke. In case you missed it. They would come and even if they had gotten TPA and the damage was tiny in the brain is very intolerant of any damage, no matter how small. And they would come and say, my arm is fine, my leg is fine, but my brain is in a fog. And so I started to look into what is the impact of stroke on dementia and how does this work? And we began to learn a lot about what's going on. In the meantime, imaging told us there was such a thing as a covert stroke, scary as hell, but there is such a thing as a covert stroke. The patient is suffering damage to a small part of the brain, but doesn't feel it, doesn't react to it, because it isn't a big blood clot that has gone up and impacted itself against a blood vessel. It is a small arteriole that is inflamed and shuts itself down, causing what we see here, multiple areas, multiple scars in the white matter of the brain that is impacting connectivity of different brain structures, and that patient is now cognitively impaired. So I went from stroke to thinking about dementia and learned a hell of a lot, which I'm going to try to transmit to you. First of all, this is an incredibly scary condition. Many times when we talk about it, people say, what, there's something you can do about decreasing your risk for dementia? And the answer is absolutely yes. There are things that we as individuals can do. There are things that our leaders can do. There are things our governments can do. And that is really essential for us to now get hold of this thing. Look at number 6. All of the money we're spending now on our healthcare system by the year 2040, which is tomorrow, is not going to be enough to take care of dementia alone. We don't do something to prevent this condition, we're going to be in deep trouble very quickly. Dementia is an umbrella term. Please don't go out of here saying Dr. Hakim denies the existence of Alzheimer's disease. I don't. Alzheimer's disease does exist. But the statement that Alzheimer's disease is the major cause of dementia is now not appropriate and not correct. And so let me give you a bit of a glimpse of what's going on. Alzheimer's disease is the accumulation of toxic proteins in the brain. The pathologist looks at a brain and he can see what we now call plaques and tangles, and those are those proteins that have accumulated that are toxic to the brain. And so the pathologist says, I don't know what the clinical story is, but this patient suffered Alzheimer's disease because I see the plaques and the tangles. And they are the result of cleavage of the amyloid precursor protein by beta and gamma secretase rather than alpha secretase, and that results in the accumulation of neurotoxic peptides in the brain. The first hint that that may not be the entire story began to accrue in the medical literature slowly. Here is a study in which 5,715 cases that had been signed out as being demented due to a specific condition. And of course, the biggest group was demented due to Alzheimer's disease. And they said, what else is going on with these patients? And so here's the first column. Of the major 4,629 of the 5,700 and so patients had been signed out as suffering from Alzheimer's disease. In their hippocampus, there were plaques and tangles. And so they said, what else is going on? 80% of them had a vascular problem. And people said, okay, they have Alzheimer's disease and they have vascular problems. But the two things were not connected as cause and effect. This is a much more recent study that came out last year, and I'm proud to say it came out from the Montreal Neurological Institute and their imaging center. They had put together, I forget the exact number, but about 1,400 people. It started with HC. These are normal controls. People who are like you and me, walking around doing absolutely fine, who accepted to be studied in an extensive way. And the first thing they did was at the Montreal Neurological Institute, they measured blood flow to the brain, they measured glucose utilization, and then they did lumbar punctures on these normal people, and they looked at the CSF accumulation of these toxic proteins that we talked about that cause Alzheimer's disease. And then they waited till these people, starting out normally, were studied again when they developed early mild cognitive impairment, and then late mild cognitive impairment, and then late onset dementia, but it's late onset Alzheimer's disease. It's interesting how the two terms are so interchangeable. And then they looked at the data. the very first thing that happens in the brain of a normal person who is committed to develop memory issues is a change in blood flow. Blood flow to the brain goes down as the very first insult to the brain that is going to develop memory issues. Why is that? It's because your brain is so dependent on its blood supply. This thing weighs 2% of your body weight, but consumes 20% of the energy that you produce. It is an absolute energy pig. It is looking for things to shut down in your brain because it is just too energetically expensive to keep everything going. So the brain that develops these tiny occlusions that we talked about, this inflammation in the arterioles, those patients, by the way, have that same condition in the retina, and they're going blind, in the heart, and they're having heart trouble, in the kidneys, and they're needing dialysis. And so we're talking about a systemic condition here that is driving dementia in a significant way. But most importantly, the first insult that occurs in the brain that is going to develop memory difficulty is that there is a change in flow. So Debbie Barnes looked at what conditions are associated with dementia. And what it turned out, and she looked at North America and the rest of the world because there are differences in our behaviors between those two entities. And so let's look at the North America percentages. Low education is associated with dementia later on. Smoking, physical inactivity. In North America, we sit down and drive to work, we sit down at work at our desk, we sit down to drive home, we sit down at supper, and then we sit down to watch TV. And they said, okay, this is now an association. Physical inactivity, sadness and depression was identified as a cause for dementia. High blood pressure was identified as an association with dementia, diabetes, and obesity. I will take a few minutes to go through some of this, but the conclusion was you and I have the ability to control, to reduce our risk for dementia by paying attention to some of these factors that are associated with dementia. And as I said, your brain, no matter what you're doing, is scanning your environment, both internal and external. And it is going to react to everything you do and everything you do not do. If you do not do the right things, your brain begins to react to that. So, here's a few striking examples. In London, England, cab drivers have to study the map of London in enormous detail, every highway, every street, every tiny road for 4 years. And they take exams. And they are allowed to sit behind the wheel only when they pass the exams. And there are some who fail the exams. So they compared the MRI scans of those who passed and those who didn't pass. This is 4 years of studying the map of London by heart, okay? And what it turns out, are you ready? The parts of their brains, those who had passed, that have to do with mapping and knowing where you are in space was bigger in them. You have control over the size of your brain. You and I have control over what part of the brain gets bigger and what part of the brain stays small. And so this was the first evidence that we have something to say about it. High blood pressure is incredibly damaging to the brain, as are all risk factors. And the normal systolic blood pressure is 120, and it shouldn't be above that. Midlife overweight and obesity. Midlife overweight and obesity has something to say about your risk for dementia later on. And both overweight and obesity at midlife independently increase the risk of dementia later on, because the fat that we accumulate around our abdomen is inflammatory, and it goes and in the presence of that fat occludes the tiny blood vessels that are feeding the white matter of the brain. playing a computer game. I work in a big hospital. I go into the cafeteria and 80% of the people having lunch are using an iPhone or doing something like that. And it turns out that this has been studied. And if you are eating while you're distracted, your stomach is full, but your brain is hungry. It didn't eat because it didn't taste the food that you were shoveling down your throat. And so it became very important to also think about this. Exercise training increases the size of the hippocampus. Who knew that we, by moving our muscles, good hormones go up to our brain and open blood vessels. And our hippocampus thanks you for moving around. And we didn't even ever make a relationship between exercise activity and the health of our brain and our memory function. The message usually is take it easy. Find easy way to do things. You have an iPhone. If I give you a subtraction to do, you're going to pull it out and put in the two numbers instead of letting your brain work a little hard. And we say the same thing about exercise. Take it easy. Take it easy. So these guys are going in to kill themselves working on treadmills, etc. But here's an opportunity right in front of them to burn a few calories, and they're not doing it. And you and I are not doing it either. We take elevators to 2 floors. We take elevators to 3 or 4 floors. What we're talking about here is re-educating the public, re-educating ourselves about making life hard, not making life easy. And so that's the important message when it comes to the relationship between exercise and our cognitive function. Finally, sleep. If you don't sleep 7 or 8 hours, you're going to have fog in your brain when you wake up. It's incredibly important to, and if you're someone who, because of your age or whatever other problem, you have to get up and go to the bathroom 3 times during the night, then you have to extend your sleep to make up for that. And so during sleep, the brain is repairing itself. The brain is cleaning itself up. That's tune-up time for the brain. It is getting rid of all the toxins that have accumulated during the day because it's such a high energy demanding and burning organ. And so you have to respect the fact that sleep is essential. I have put all of this early in my career into a book called The 7 Rules You Can Follow to Keep Dementia at Bay. Grow your brain's cognitive reserve, which is what the cab drivers do. But if you're not going to drive a cab in London, England, then learn a second language, learn a third language. Keep your brain working. Don't let it go to rest because it is looking for stuff to shut down by you. And if you rest it, that's the message it gets. Avoid strokes. Keep blood pressure when you are at rest at a systolic of 120 and not much higher. Eat well, but avoid obesity. Active lifestyle is key. Make life hard. You must sleep enough. Have a positive attitude because depression, sadness, when it is sustained, is also pro-inflammatory and it needs to be avoided. I have put all of this in this book, and I wrote it for the public and not for you guys, so don't bother. But I am deeply honored, and as I have said, it took a village. Thank you to the Gairdner Foundation for the immense honor of bestowing upon me the 2017 Gairdner Wightman Award. I have enormous debt and gratitude towards the committed Canadian Stroke Network team. There were many, many times when I had to just get out of the way. Members of the team were just going out there to make good things happen, as you have heard. Scientists and clinicians across Canada, the University of Ottawa, the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, all of them were incredibly supportive. And this was the team that worked very, very hard to make all this good stuff happen and make Canada a leader in stroke care. You know, the conclusion was Canada is small enough to be organizable, but big enough to have an international impact. And I also want to thank my family who have honored me by being here. If it wasn't for my wife's support so that I can continue to be absent from home, and I would say, go to the beach, I'll be right there, and they would come up for supper, I would still be on my computer. And so I am very grateful for the support that I've gotten from them. And thank you, all of you, for being here today. Thank you. Thank you.